Hello everyone, and welcome back for the sixth and final week of our Introduction to Lithic Analysis course. Today we'll be covering artifact illustration and microscopic analysis techniques. There's a lot of material for this week, so we're going to jump right in, starting with illustration. Lithic artifact illustration has been fundamental in studies related to lithic analysis for a long time and is incorporated into a lot of modern studies as well. It's a way to visually represent the artifacts by showing emphasis on specific features. Naturally, the outcome of one's illustration partially depends on their artistic skill level. However, there are some conventions that require little skill and still show a lot of information. There are a lot of also specific conventions to follow, such as orientation and symbolism used to define features. For example, artifacts are typically oriented with the proximal end or where the butt is located down. So this may vary based on artifact type. So it's just really important to check the conventions for specific artifacts, as they do sometimes vary. Different features should be portrayed by using various symbolism as well, such as stippling, which is used to indicate cortex coverage. Negative flake scars are drawn in line work, which is distinguished by ripple lines and continuous lines to indicate the directionality of flake removals. And retouch is shown as small flake removals. Natural alterations should be shown as well, distinguishing them from any human-made alterations. So here's an example of some of the different symbolisms that you can use during lithic illustration. In illustrations, the ventral face is often omitted in favor of portraying the dorsal face only. So it's fairly common to see illustrations of only the dorsal surface along with a side profile view or a cross-section. This is generally due to the fact that more information can be gained from the dorsal face as related to stage of reduction and retouch, whereas the ventral face is often a single surface. However, if the ventral face does exhibit characteristics such as retouch or flake scars, it is still important to illustrate the ventral surface as well. So adjacent to the dorsal face, side views and profiles should be placed on the illustration. Vertical cross sections should be placed to the right of the dorsal view and centrally between dorsal and ventral if both are present. Horizontal cross sections should be placed either above or below the dorsal view. So if a cross section of a particular part is being shown, such as the tip of an implement, convention is that it should be drawn alongside its true position. It's common for small lines to be used, linking the views together to indicate the relationship. Lithic artifacts are typically drawn to a true scale, which is a 1:1 scale representing their actual size, or a 2:1 scale for small pieces such as microliths, which means they're drawn at twice life size. In the case that the artifact is being drawn to scale, the easiest and most common method is tracing. To do this, the artifact is placed on a drawing surface, sometimes held in place by blue tack. Then the pencil lead is held perpendicular to the drawing surface and positioned vertically against the artifact, to carefully create an outline. And you can ensure accuracy of the outline by comparing it with the artifact by using an upright set square. And because of the immersive use of the object, great care should be taken to avoid damaging any delicate edges or features. Another way to draw the outline would be through a series of dots marked on the paper to indicate main features and then connecting them together, checking accuracy by comparing with the artifact. Following the outline, flake removals should be drawn, usually starting at the area where they intersect the outline. Again, comparison with the artifact is really important here, and measurements can be taken to improve accuracy as well. Once all of the outlines are complete, you can move on to adding in symbolism such as stippling for cortex and curved line marks to indicate scar direction. For this part, work by eye from the object and continue side-by-side comparisons for accuracy. If the ventral view is required, you can take the trace of the dorsal view on another sheet and then reverse it so it shows the ventral, and then add in the features that are present on the ventral face. Once the drawing has been checked, edited, and approved, you can move on to inking. So prior to this step, everything should be done in pencil. And then during inking, it's really important to include all of the same features and details that are contained in the pencil drawing. It's also important to prevent any smudges. So a common convention is to have a blank sheet of paper underneath the drawing hand. When included, cross sections can be left blank, filled in with oblique lines, or be blacked out. Any lettering should be included by the illustrator, such as lettering to indicate a particular point on the artifact, and any indicator lines should also be included. And finally, a scale is always required. Now we're moving on to the final topic, which is microscopic analysis. The goals of microscopic lithic analysis are to interpret stone tool functionality through preserved use wear and residues along tool edges and surfaces. Due to the small nature of these traces, magnification is typically required. Both low and high level microscopy methods can be used, and when combined, they offer variable perspectives for tool analysis. As we've discussed previously, Semenov in 1964 is largely credited with the introduction of microscopic analysis techniques to lithic artifacts by interpreting wear patterns through a scanning electron microscope. Since his 1964 project, the field has substantially developed to include a number of methods and technologies. A lot of experimental work has been done in traceological research, contributing a vast amount to our understanding of stone tool functional use. Through such experiments, it has been shown that use wear traces and residue deposits vary visibly based on the material that's been worked, as well as the action of use, and thus it can be functionally diagnostic when attempting to reach interpretations about tool use. Because of the differential nature between use wear and residue deposits, there are a few different techniques to approach each subject. Microscopic analysis can occur in both low-powered and high-powered forms. Low-power approaches tend to cover magnification up to 100 times zoom, and high-powered approaches go beyond that. We'll be talking mostly about high-powered approaches, for interpreting use wear, one of the most common methods, we've mentioned it before, is scanning electron microscopy, also known as SEM. This method uses a controlled electron field to capture images through backscattered electrons that are reflected off the surface topography of an object. Another common technique is optical light microscopy, or OLM. OLM works by creating a magnified image through the use of a series of glass lenses focusing a beam of light onto an object, which is then enlarged by a convex lens. Compared to OLM, SEM tends to be more accurate in terms of residue identification. There's also laser scanning confocal microscopy, or LSCM. It's fairly common as well. This is an optical imaging technique for increasing resolution and contrast of a micrograph by means of using a spatial pinhole to block out of focus light in image formation. A common technique for the identification of residues is EDX, or electron dispersive X-ray, which provides a signature for the elemental and chemical characterizations of a sample. Raman spectroscopy is another method of residue analysis using a light scattering technique to detect radiation emissions. FTIR, or Fourier transform infrared microscopy, is another possible technique that uses infrared light to obtain a compositional spectrum and chemical properties of the sample. The key difference between FTIR and Raman spectroscopy is that FTIR technique measures how much light is remaining from the original light from the light source, whereas Raman spectroscopy measures the energy that scatters after being excited by a laser. Through microscopic use wear analysis, we can interpret numerous aspects of tool functionality, including mode of use, such as prehensile use versus hafted technology, active versus inactive surfaces, material worked, motion and directionality of use, and action of primary use. Primary characteristics of function are related to fracture patterns, scar morphology, and distribution, presence of polishes, striations, and bright spots, and remnants of variable matter such as animal or hafting residues. Because this is a particularly visually based science, it's important to remember the influence of analyst experience and subjectivity. To counteract these possible inconsistencies, comparable collections and literature reviews should be utilized extensively during the analysis. It's also important to remember that a wide variety of behavioral and geological factors can affect the microwear traces preserved on the edges of archaeological tools. Here are a few comparative images of flint surfaces used in various contexts based on a study done by Evans in 2008. As you can see, the unmodified flint surface appears relatively rough, dull, and unpolished. It has clearly textured surface, and it reflects the microcrystalline nature of the material. The dry hide polished surface is markedly different from an unused surface. The worn surface, though still rough, shows signs of alteration such as the smoothing of high spots on the flint surface. Similarly, wear from greasy hide and dry hide measure very comparably in terms of roughness and thus visual appearance. The fresh hide wear is clearly more pronounced and extensive, covering almost the entire surface and causing the general appearance of a series of domed features with a fairly smooth transition between peaks and valleys. And then, as you can see, the antler and wood polished surfaces, again, are entirely different from the hide working pieces. The polished surfaces produced on tools that worked hard materials such as wood and antler are generally much smoother than those produced by any of the hide or skins. They also appear visually distinct from each other. So wear from whittling antler seems to have an undulating character that is parallel to the working direction and also presents distinct striations. The wood polish, on the other hand, lacks striations and appears more flat and reticulated than the antler polish. These two wear types are often hard to distinguish from one another, and it is often the presence of small-scale features such as striations to help make the distinction. However, as a general concept, when assessing use wear, it's important to remember that harder materials tend to cause more smoothing to the exposed parts of the tool rather than soft materials, which is kind of intuitive. Residues, as briefly mentioned before, are related to various material deposits left behind on the surface of stone tools. These can either be interpreted through direct microscopic observation of the lithic piece itself or through mechanical extraction and isolation methods. And then when interpreting residues, spatial distribution is of relevance, and it should be determined whether distribution of the residue is an isolated incident or a collective incident. Isolated residues tend to be related to contamination or other factors unrelated to use. In contrast, when one type of micro residue is widespread over all surfaces of a stone artifact, it may be related to a naturally occurring chemical or biological process that has taken place over time, such as we mentioned way back in the beginning of this class, the process of diagenesis. Another important thing to consider in residue analysis is the role of contamination, and for this reason, artifacts should be thoroughly washed prior to analysis. It's been determined through some case studies that if originating from tool use, residue should still be present on the artifact even after washing has occurred, so washing doesn't really seem to have much of an impact on the preservation of residue materials during analysis. Animal processing comes in a variety of forms, and animal materials are one of the most common worked with stone tools, especially with related to activities such as butchering and skinning. So there are a few different ways to interpret animal processing through use wear and residue analysis, largely determinant on the material being worked. Related to butchering, residues such as muscle tissue, blood, collagen, and fat can be visually observed on the surface. Collagen has been often reported as being fibers that appear opaque and birefringent, which means that it causes the refraction of light to form two rays in slightly different directions. It can be detected through laser scanning techniques. This can make it easy to determine on stone tool surfaces when using some of the other high-powered techniques as well. Brownish-reddish fibers are observed to be muscular tissue, while fat residue can appear as smudges and fibrous strings. Blood vessels can also appear as dark, thin strings. And while SEM cannot observe color, such fibers can still easily be identified by their morphology. Also related to animal processing, bone working, microscopically remnants of bone appear as amorphous in compact structures represented by white or dark masses depending on the analysis method used, and they can sometimes look greasy depending on the type of bone. Similar to bone, antler residue can appear as a somewhat amorphous blob. It can also cause substantial edge wear represented through smoothing and polishing on the edges. In terms of hide and skin working, the most common residue left behind is clusters of white fibers, often at the edge of tools. Polishes can also be representative of skin and flesh working, and when related to avian processing, distinct residues include small feathers and greasy tissue. Stoneworking is yet another distinguishable activity and may be most commonly attributed to production of stone engravings. When analyzing the use-wear deriving from stoneworking, rounding is the most frequently observed feature, and well-developed rounding can be considered as diagnostic as a trace for stoneworking. Scarring is common as well, but should be considered as a complementary trace to rounding because it has a high variability and is not always preserved. So this produces a high degree of micropolish, which can be clearly observed. Residue can also be preserved on the stone edge, showing what type of material was worked. In determining projectile use, the most common feature is diagnostic impact fractures, which include step terminations, hinge terminations, burination, and spin-off fractures, which are caused by impact with a target. This feature is usually macroscopically visible in most cases as well. And aside from diagnostic impact fractures, projectiles can also be inferred based on the size of the piece and the presence of hafting traces. Hafting traces are most noticeable by the presence of a distinct boundary between the point of wear traces and the part that was contained within the haft. Wear around the edge of the haft is often more intense, caused by an increase of pressure that is exerted at the point of haft. This is generally marked by abrupt scarring or the presence of bright, well-developed spots or polish and striations that starts abruptly. Plant processing can leave behind residues as well, which present as clumps of fine fibered material with the appearance largely dependent on the type of plant worked. In addition to this residue, woodworking and plant processing also produce a bright polish on the surface of stone tools. Taphonomic processes can leave behind features that are detectable in microscopic analysis as well and should remain in consideration because in some instances they can appear to mimic some other traces of activities. One common action that impacts edge wear is that of trampling, which is presented by significant abrasion and microfracturing to the edge of tools. It can be produced by humans or animals, but the result is often the same. Another variable is thermal alteration, which can be distinguished by fracture lines throughout the surface of the stone tool. Edge rounding, if not alongside any other form of traceological features, can also be assumed to be related to taphonomic processes. Despite its popularity in research throughout recent decades, microwear studies have faced criticism and skepticism as some believe its results to be ineffective. This is largely due to the potential inaccuracies that can be made during such analysis, thus implying the technique itself lacks precision and is governed largely by subjectivity. Some issues with use-wear studies have been found in the lack of consistent terminology used by analysts, which often leads to confusion in categorization, as well as a muddled pool of references that are all somewhat inconsistent with each other. Another common problem is analyst subjectivity and experience level, as it can be difficult to visually discern these minute traces from one another without a lot of experience or without a comparative collection that you have access to. In addition to analyst subjectivity, other factors can affect accuracy of interpreting wear traces as well, including post-depositional alterations such as patination and other weathering processes, or post-excavation treatment of material that may lead to contamination. Another important variable to consider is the variability found across experimental projects, which make up a large portion of the research surrounding lithic functional analysis. Raw material also has an impact on the readability of use-wear traces, with materials such as flint and chert being the primary focus of a lot of research. However, there are distinct differences in use-wear that can be dependent on material type. As mentioned before, contamination can be a major influence in how stone tools are interpreted, and so it's important to reduce the likelihood of their presence by ensuring clean lab settings and proper artifact handling. Besides the correct identification of the residue's type, one of the most common and controversial problems one can face in residue analysis is the differentiation between ancient and modern material. To avoid contamination, it's suggested to analyze artifacts soon after they're excavated. However, this is usually not always able to be done. The most common forms of contaminants are skin, pencil marks, fibers, and paralloid, which is used for labeling. Skin flakes are by far the most recurring modern residue on stone tools and is indicated by small flakes and spots on the surface of the stone tools. Pencil marks are also very common as a byproduct of illustration and are seen as a black marking along the edge length. Another thing to consider is that modern contamination can depend a lot on the raw material type being studied. So when dealing with coarse materials such as quartzite, basalt, and granite, one can expect a higher incidence of modern residue, especially skin flakes, distributed along the microtopographical irregularities on the surface. Flat materials such as obsidian tend to not retain a large quantity of skin flakes, but do exhibit a lot more dirt and sediment that can be evident on the surface. And I know that's a lot of material, as always, but this concludes our Introduction to Lithic Analysis course. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out. I'd love to help and have conversations about stone tools. Otherwise, good luck on the exam, and thank you for joining me.